In the late summer of 1944, a German military doctor named Werner Voss sat inside a temporary holding area somewhere behind the American lines in Normandy and did something he had not expected to do. He counted. Voss had been captured in the collapse following the Cobra breakout in late July, and in the hours after his capture, he had been moved, processed, and placed in a collection point where wounded men from both sides were being treated. He had not been mistreated. He had been given water. A U.S. medical officer had examined him briefly and moved on. What Voss watched over the next several hours, with the trained eye of a man who had spent 3 years managing German casualty evacuation on the Eastern Front, was something he would later describe in a post-war interrogation report as unlike anything he had been prepared to see. Not because it was advanced, not because it used equipment he did not recognize, because it was fast. Because it moved in a way that, by every standard he knew, should have been impossible to sustain. Wounded men arrived at the collection point, were sorted, treated, stabilized, and moved again within the men who, by German triage standards, would have been set aside, held for later, or not expected to serve, were being loaded onto vehicles and driven to the rear with the same urgency as often. He counted stretcher cases. He counted the time between arrival and departure. He did the arithmetic in it. The numbers did not make sense. He had spent 3 years watching men die in the gap between the front line and the hospital. He understood that. He had learned to manage it, to triage it, to accept the deaths it produced as a structural fact of war. What he was watching now suggested that the Americans had simply refused to accept that. And what disturbed him most was not that they had found a solution. It was that the solution was not a technology. It was not a miracle drug or a new surgical technique. It was a decision made somewhere by someone that every wounded American soldier would reach a certain time. And then the patient construction of a system designed to make that. Voss wrote later that watching the American evacuation chain operate was like watching a floor. Precise, redundant, He meant it as an observation, not a compliment. But somewhere underneath the clinical language, you can hear else. You can hear a man who understood his own system clearly enough to know exactly what he's looking at. If this story reaches you the way it reaches me, subscribe to the channel. It helps this content find the people who can. This video is not about doctors. The Americans had good surgeons, but it is not about more equipment. German surgical technique in 1944 was, in many respects, the equal of any fielded. This is about something the German medical system could not replicate, no matter how many doctors it employed. It is about what happens when a nation decides, at institutional level, that the life of a private in a foxhole is worth the same investment as the life of a quarters, and then builds a system around that decision and funds it, mans it, motorizes it, and defends it with the same urgency it brings to feeding front. To understand what Werner Voss was watching that day, we need to go back, not to Normandy, but to a series of decisions made years earlier in offices from any battlefield, by men who understood that the next war would be fought with of civilians, and that those civilians would expect to come home. The United States Army Medical Department entered the Second World War with lessons from the first into its doctrine. The lesson of 1917 and 1980 brutal and clear. Men who could have survived their wounds died not because injuries were unsurvivable, but because they received care too late. The problem was not the surgery. The problem was the gap between the moment of wounding and the moment hands could close it. That gap, measured in hours, was where most men who died of survival actually died. The Army's medical planners spent the 1930s and early 40s building a system to eliminate it. The shield had 5 links. The first link was the aid man, or medic, assigned at the platoon level, one for every rough 50 soldiers. His job was not to perform surgery. His job, reach a wounded man with minutes, stop the bleeding, plasma if the man was in shock, casualty tag with the treatment given, and get him. That was it. Reach him fast, move him. The aid man was not a doctor. He was a trained technician executing a specific and critical function in a chain that extended to a general hospital. Link was the battalion aid station, typically located 300 yards behind the front line. This was not a treatment in any comprehensive sense. sorting and forwarding point. A medical officer was present, stabilization was performed, was administered to men in shock, morphine was managed on the casualty tag. The goal was to meet at the battalion aid station. The goal was to move men through it within 30 minutes of arrival. The third link was the regimental collecting company, further to the rear, where men were sorted and prepared for ambulance transport. The fourth link was the division clearing station, the first point in the chain with enabling full surgical capability. And the fifth link was the evacuation hospital, a mobile, large-capacity surgical facility designed to follow the advance, receive serious cases within what the Army's own publications called the crew, and get them onto the table. The entire chain was designed to number 4 hours. The Army's medical planners had determined that a man with a serious abdominal wound, a chest wound, or major vascular injury who received definitive surgical care within 4 hours of wounding had a survival rate dramatically higher than a man who 8 or 12 hours. 4 hours was the target. The system was built around hitting it. What this required was not brilliance. It required motorization. It required an ambulance that could reach a forward position under fire. It required enough plasma and whole blood at the battalion aids to keep a man in shock alive during transport. It required enough radio communication between the aid station and the clearing that the receiving end knew what was coming. And it required the organizational commitment to every link in that chain as not logistically secondary. The Army treated its medical system as a combat system. It was staffed accordingly, and prioritized accordingly. That phrase. It will matter later. An American infantry division in Normandy in the summer of 1944 carried rough medical personnel within its organization. Aid men at the platoon, medical officers at the battalion level, a division surgeon coordinating the whole, motor transport dedicated exclusively to casualty movement. That 800-man medical establishment was not pulling double-deckers or cooks, mission handlers. They were medical personnel, equipped and ascension. Now hold that number. The results showed up in the statistics. Across the European of operations in 1944 and 1945, the mortality rate among U.S. soldiers who were wounded and was approximately 3 to 4%. That number, is not the overall casualty rate. It is the death rate among men when they reached the first link in the chain. 96 to 90 of every 100 who made it to a medic survived. The military surgical death rate, the rate of men who died of wounds after receiving medical attention, had dropped from 8.1% in the First World War to 3.3% by the end of the Second. That reduction, primarily a function of better surgery, had improved. It was primarily speed. Men were reaching the table fast. When you reach the table faster, more men live. But before we get to what that sister fire, we need to understand the man at the beginning, the man American soldier saw first. His name in the regulation, aidman, in the foxholes, was Doc. He was not a doctor. He was, in most cases, a young man in his 20s, completed roughly 6 months of medical training at a stateside facility, to treat the most common battlefield injuries with speed and under fire, and a rifle platoon as its sole organic medical asset. He carried morphine bandages, plasma, and a set of casualty tags. He did not carry a rifle in most cases, though he was permitted to do so in self-defense. His protective status under the Geneva Convention, in theory, enemy soldiers were not to target him. In practice, the distinction between a man with a band and a man with a weapon always observed. Aid men were killed at high rates. They exposed themselves to the same treating because the men they were treating were exposed to it. What distinguished the American equivalent position in other armies training alone? It was his position in the chain. A rear area asset when casualties were. He went to the platoon with it. He ate. He dug in. When the platoon took fire, he was already there. The gap between the moment of wound and the moment of first treatment was measured in minutes, sometimes seconds, because the man responsible for closing that gap was standing 30 feet away when the bullet did. In Normandy, on June 6, 1940, the American faced the worst test it would encounter in the war. Omaha Beach. The first waves of the 29th1st Infantry Division hit the beach at roughly 6:30 in the morning. Within the four, they had taken casualties on a scale that the medical plan had not fully accounted. The plan assumed a certain number of aid men would make it ashore and function. On the Dog Green and Dog White sectors, many of them died in the water or on the sand before they could treat a single man. The naval vessels that were supposed to serve evacuation points were in some cases unable to reach. Wounded men in the surf drowned because no one could reach them. In those first 90 minutes, close to breaking entirely. And then, it did not break. What happened next is one of the least stories of D-Day. The aid men who survived began working. Not in organizing, not according to plan. They worked in the chaos that the plan had not anticipated, treating men behind the seawall, in shell crater at the waterline under fire, crawling between bodies to reach men who were still alive. Private First Class John Shea, a medic with the 29th Infantry Division, did over 30 casualties in the first 2 hours on Omaha Beach, while refusing to take cover. The man he could reach had been treated. He was killed later that morning. He was 22 years old. The evacuation from Omaha Beach itself was improvised in the first hours. Landing ship, tanks, the large flat designated as tank carriers, were on the fly to casualty carriers. Men were carried back to naval vessels. Surgeons operated on warships in the channel. The chain that had been designed with sequential flow was functioning in fragments, with each fragment doing what it could. By the end of June 6th, the system had held perfectly, with losses that the medical planners would study and revise for months afterward. But the fundamental architecture, the layered chain, the organic aid man, the forward aid station, the rapid movement, had prevented the casualty toll from becoming catastrophically worse. The men who came after the first wave found a beach that was being managed, being moved. The chain was assembling itself under fire, link by link. Following 6 weeks, as the fighting moved off the beaches and into the hedgerow country of the bocage, the system that astonished the few German medical officers who had any opportunity to observe it. The hedgerow fighting was not the clean advance the planners had imagined. It was close, grinding, terrain fighting, with casualties occurring at untable points across a front that had no clear rear. Aid men worked in ditches. Battalion aid stations were set up in farm buildings 300 yards from active firefights. The evacuation had to bend itself to fire that had not been anticipated. It bent. It did not break. By July of 1944, the American medical chain in Normandy was processing thousands of casualties per week and achieving something that, to a German medical officer with any knowledge of performance on the Eastern Front or in North Africa, was simply not supposed to be possible. A wounded soldier who reached the battalion alive had a better chance of surviving. That was not a projection. That was a documented outcome. Now we need to talk about what Werner Voss's army was doing side of the line. The military medical system in 1944 was Germany had excellent surgeons. German medical education was among the best in the world. The Wehrmacht's medical personnel were trained, committed, and in many cases brave. Men with advanced surgical training in field conditions throughout the war. The individual competence within the system itself was broken. The first problem was structural. The German relied primarily on rail transport to move casualties from forward areas to rear hospitals. Motor ambulance transport existed, but was limited directly with the Army's primary logistical need, which was moving ammunition and fuel to the front. When the motor transport pool came under pressure, and before it was under severe pressure, medical evacuation lost the competition. Ammunition went forward. Wounded men waited. The second problem was personnel. A German infantry division in Normandy in the summer of 1944 had fewer organic men than its American counterpart, and the personnel it had were not distributed through the unit in the same way. The Sanitätssoldat, the German equivalent of the aid man, existed, but the ratio of medical personnel to combat was lower than in American formation, and the depth of training for forward-level treatment was shallower. Problem was supply. German access to blood plasma in 1944 was severely limited. The American blood supply system had been organized on an industrial scale, with donor drives in the United States generating hundreds of thousands of units of whole blood and plasma shipped to theaters. By the time of Overlord, American medical units in Europe had access to blood products at an aid station level, meaning a man going into shock from blood loss could be treated with plasma within minutes. German wounded who needed blood transfusions waited until they reached a hospital. The difference in survival rates for men with hemorrhagic was not primarily a function of surgical skill. It was a function of plasma or blood reached the wound. The fourth problem was philosophical, and it was the German medical system, like the German army as a whole, was a hierarchy of value. Officers received priority of treatment at every level of the evacuation chain. This was not a formal written policy in every case, but it was a practiced reality documented in post-war accounts and observed by Allied medical officers examining captured German medical. When triage decisions had to be made under resource constraints, rank influenced those decisions. An enlisted soldier with the same wound as an officer faced longer waits. The American system did not work this way. This was not because American military culture was without hierarchy. It was because the doctrine governing the medical chain stated explicitly and in practice that triage decisions were to be made on the basis of clinical need and evacuation priority, not rank. With an abdominal wound, lieutenant with a hand wound, be sequenced for treatment in that order. The private went first. That sounds obvious. It was not obvious. It was a choice, embedded in doctrine, that reflected something about what the American army believed its soldiers were worth. German medical officers who examined the American system after the war returned repeatedly to this point in their post-war testimony. The U.S. Army's 5th Army Surgeon conducted a full assessment of captured German medical installations in May of 1945, and the findings documented the gap with clinical precision. German officers interviewed of that assessment described the American system in ways that consistently revealed the same core bewilderment, not at the technology, at the commitment. One German medical officer, whose identity was recorded only by rank, described the American evacuation chain as, in his estimation, an industrial process applied to human life. He meant it as a description of scale and efficiency, but the phrase itself reveals the confusion at the center of the German reaction. For an officer trained in a system where resource constraints produced triage hierarchies, and where enlisted soldiers could expect longer wait than their officers, the idea that the Americans had built that processed every wounded man with the same urgency of rank and sustained that across an entire theater of operations was not just it was incomprehensible. Because incomprehensible is the right, not technically incomprehensible. The technology was visible. The Jeep ambulances were not secret weapons. The plasma guide. A German engineer could have examined every piece of equipment in an American battalion aid station and understood its function completely. What was incomprehensible was the will behind it. The decision to build and man and supply and protect this system at this scale, every soldier, regardless of, required a national commitment that the German system, for reasons that went far deeper than doctrine, had never made. We need to understand why. The German army's relationship with its wounded was shaped by a set of assumptions that had been embedded in German military for generations. The soldier was an instrument of national purpose. His value to the state was a function of his fighting. When his capacity was gone, the resources devoted to his recovery were weighed against the operational needs of the unit he had left. This was not cruelty. It was a military law that treated human beings' input to a production process, valued in terms of their output. The American army operated on a different logic. Part of it was practical. The United States was with an army built almost entirely from civilians who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that their country valued their lives. Believed his army would do everything possible to bring him home alive, would, in theory, fight with greater confidence a soldier who understood that he was expendable. The investment in medical evacuation was, in part, an investment in morale and fighting effectiveness. But there was something else underneath the practical argument. Something that showed up in the fact that the medical system was built before anyone knew whether it would pay off tactically. Something that showed up in the number of aid men deployed, in the blood supply shipped across the Atlantic, in the hospital ships anchored off Normandy on June 6th before the first soldier had even hit the beach. The Americans had built this system before the war, funded it and staffed it, defended its resource allocation in the late 1930s. Because some DNA of the institution, there was an assumption that it would be and that it was the right thing to do. The German system assumption, claim on the individual soldier was total. The state's obligation to that soldier ended at the operational level. Hold that contrast of everything that follows. In 1944, the American medical system faced a test that in some ways exceeded, not in the intensity of casualties over a single day, but in the sustained pressure on the system under conditions it had not been designed to handle. The Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, at 5:30 in the morning, the Wehrmacht launched its largest offensive of the Western campaign, driving 3 armies forest in Luxembourg and Belgium. Within 48 hours, American units across a 75 front were surrounded, retreating, or fighting in isolation. The evacuation chain, which depended on motor transport and rear, was being cut. German units were bypassing American positions and moving into the rear areas where clearing station hospitals were operating. The system that had been around a stable front and predictable rearward was suddenly operating in a front that did not exist. The 100th Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, presented the most acute version of the problem. Within the perimeter, the division's medical supplies were captured on 10th when a German column overran a concierge. The division's medical company had hundreds of casualties, with a fraction of the supplies required. Surgeons operated with whatever they had, received what could be scrounged. The chain ensued not because it was well supplied, but because the men inside it refused to let it stop. What is less is what happened at the edges of the perimeter. 27th, after Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement corridor to Bastogne, the first vehicles that used that tanks. They were ambulances. Before ammunition resupply, the Army used the newly opened road to move casualties out. The decision reflected a priority calculation that would have puzzled the genders surrounding the town. The Americans were using to keep the evacuation chain running. Bastogne, across the December and January, the system bent conditions it had not anticipated. Frozen ground made digging impossible. Aid men worked in jeeps broke down on ice-covered roads. The evacuation chain, smooth in the summer of Normandy, was ragged and improvised and brutal, and yet held in ways that the design had not fully predicted, because the men inside the understood what the chain was for and improvised to keep it running. Aid men in the Ardennes fashioned improvised stretchers from pine branches and overcoats. They used their own body heat to thaw plasma bottles too cold to flow. Surgeons in Bastogne operated by flashlight when generators failed, and by candlelight when flashlights died. The glider surgeons who landed inside the perimeter on December after Christmas, carrying surgical kits in the same gliders that brought ammunition, set up a room in a Belgian farmhouse within 4 hours of landing and performed surgery through the night. There is a tip at the Bastogne medical situation and see it as a failure of the chain. The supplies were captured, the perimeter was surrounded. Men waited longer than they should have. All of that is true. But the correct comparison is not between the system and the actual Bastogne conditions. The correct comparison is between the actual Bastogne conditions and what the German system was producing in the scape at the same moment. German wounded in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944 were evacuating through a road network that had been planned for a rapid advance that did not materialize. The plan had assumed Antwerp. When the advance stalled, the German logistical system, already stretched to supply the offensive in the first place, no reserve capacity. German wounded were held in forward collection points, waiting for transport did not come. The roads were needed for tanks. The wounded waited. This was not an exception. It was the system operating as it had been designed to operate, with wounded men as a secondary logistical priority. And the survival rates, wounded in the same campaign, were still dramatically higher. A captured German medical officer was processed through an American clearing station in the Ardennes in late December of 1944. His name was not recorded in the source, But his statement, interpreter and included in a divisional medical record, has survived. Interpreter that he had not expected to receive surgical care. He had been wounded for 6 hours. By the standard of his own army's system, he was still in stages of evacuation. By the standard, he was already late. Past the clearing stage evacuation hospital because his injury required a surgeon. American chain had determined he could within the hour. He did not understand why they were moving so fast. He did not understand why they were moving so fast. It is not a dramatic, it is not a quotable line, but it contains the entire video in 8 words. Officer, a trained professional who understood the mechanics of casualty evacuation, watching an American clearing operate, and being unable to produce a framework that explained the urgency. Because in his army, this urgency had not been built. Not because German doctors were indifferent to their patients, not because they were indifferent to its wounded, because the system had never been given the resources, the transport, the supply lines, and the institution to move this fast for everyone who needed it. The system reflected a set of values. The speed of the chain reflected what those values had been translated into. It came time to build something real. The Americans had built something real. By the end of the war, the medical department had treated more than 500,000 battle casualties in the European theater. Of those men who reached medical care alive, 96 to 97 out of every 100 survived. The mortality rate among men who received surgical care had been cut more than in half compared to the First World War, almost entirely due to the speed of the evacuation chain and the availability of blood products at the forward level. Penicillin deserves its own sentence. The widespread deployment of penicillin to American medical units beginning in late 1943 represented a fundamental change in the treatment of wound infection, which had been a leading death in previous wars. German forces in 1944 did not have access to penicillin. The antibiotic was German medical authorities. It was unavailable in meaningful quantities. American soldiers who died from infected wounds in any previous war survived because they received penicillin within hours of injury. German soldiers with the same wounds faced infection with the same tools their grandfathers had used. The gap between what an American soldier could expect and what a German soldier could expect, wounding to the moment of recovery, was not primarily a gap in medical science. It was a gap in industrial capacity, organizational will, and the fundamental question of what a wounded soldier was worth. The German medical system's post-war assessors were not gentle, and the Fifth Army Surgeon's Report of May 1945 captured German medical installations and interviewed German medical documented the gap in terms that German officers themselves confirmed. Plasma had been unobtained level for most of the last year of the war. Penicillin had been unknown to German field medical units. Motor transport for casualty evacuation had by logistical priorities that outranked medical need. The individual skills of German surgeons and medical personnel had been operating in conditions of paralyzed a less determined medical corps. And it had not. Because the individual skill of a surgeon cannot close a 6-hour gap between wounding and the operating table. Only the system. Werner Voss was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He resumed medicine in a small city in what became West Germany, and maintained a modest correspondence with other Wehrmacht veterans in the years after the war. In one letter, written in the early 1950s and later archived with the papers of a German History Association, he described his memory of the American in the summer of 1944 with a clarity that suggested about it often. He wrote that what had stayed was not any specific procedure or piece of equipment. It was the faces of the American medical personnel working the station. He wrote that they moved with a quality he struggled to name, not urgency exactly, not panic, than urgency, and more human than procedure. He wrote that in his military medical systems moved with urgency when the patient was important enough, was visible enough, when the situation. What the American moved with that quality for every man who came through the door. He wrote that he had spent a long time trying to understand a system that did that. He did not record whether he ever found the answer. The answer was complicated, but it required something that a military system built on higher expendability of the individual soldier could not produce. It required the decision, made time by planners, with no guarantee it would be needed. that the soldier in the foxhole was worth the effort it would take to bring him back. Not because of his rank, not because of his utility, because he was there, and he was hurt, and the army he served that mattered. That decision was made long before the first shot was fired. It was made in the budget hearings when the Army Medical Department argued for and received the personnel authorizations to put aidmen at the platoon level. It was argued by men who had seen World War's casualty records and refused to accept that those were inevitable. It was built by the gap between the foxhole and the operating table was not a fixed feature of warfare, but an engineering problem with a solution, and that finding the solution was worth the money, the men, and the organizational priority it would cost. It was made in the logistics plans for Operation Overlord, when hospital ships were loaded and positioned before the first man hit the beach. It was made in the blood donor drives in American cities, where civilians gave blood that would be typed and packaged and cross an ocean and delivered to a battalion aid station in time to keep a 19-year-old from bleeding out in a ditch. It was made over and over in 1,000 small decisions, each one reflecting the same assumption, that every man who wore the uniform would be brought back. The German army could not copy this. Not because it lacked surgeons, not because it lacked courage, not because its medical personnel were less dedicated or less skilled, because copying it would have required dismantling of assumptions about who the soldier was and what he was worth that had been built into the German military institution for a century. Those assumptions were not written into a single regulation. They were embedded in the transport, in the structure of the triage order, in the ratio of personnel to combat troops, made 1,000 times at 1,000 levels, that when resources were scarce, something other than enlisted soldier came first. Copy a chain built on a different assumption by adding more. You have to change the assumption. By 1944, Germany was not anything fundamental about how its army. It was in a position to fight with what it had built. The German soldier was a weapon to beat. The American soldier was a citizen who had agreed to serve, and to whom the army had made an implicit promise. This was that if you were hurt, every resource the system would come for you as fast as it possibly could, regardless of your rank, that the chain would not stop until you were on a table. Werner Voss died in 1971 at his in a partial archive. His medical practice lasted more than 20 after repatriation. His letter about the American clearing station document in his correspondence that touched on his captivity. He did about it otherwise. The American aid men who served in Normandy and the Bulge are mostly gone now. The last of them were old men who were born. Their names are on the same memorial infantrymen they served with, and date, without any special designation to mark what they did and they brought back from gaps. John Shea was 22 years old when he died on Omaha Beach. From Springfield, Massachusetts. His family received his personal effects through the same system he had studied. The effects arrived in good order. Everything was accounted for. The two armed Angleville-au-Plain, Private First Class Robert Wright and Class Kenneth Moore, set up their aid station inside the village church on D-Day and treated both American and German casualties for hours while the village changed hands twice. When German soldiers entered the church, Wright and Moore continued working. The Germans, recognizing the Red Cross, did not fire. 80 men were treated in that church. The floor was covered in blood by the stained glass survived the war intact. The aid man at the front of the chain, the surgeon at the back, the jeep driver on the road between them, the donor who gave blood in a gymnasium in Ohio who never knew where it went. Each one a link, each link holding. When Werner Voss sat in the summer of 1944 and counted the dead man's arrival and his departure, he was not watching American medicine.